What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 14 DFS MVP. I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com, as always, with my co-host, Matt Savoca. If you are a new listener to the show, every week we go over our favorite values for the main slate on FanDuel and DraftKings. Follow it up with a theory segment at the end of each podcast, which teaches you how to be better at DFS, ranging from the macro to the micro. This week we're going to talk about the not so fun topic of playing through downswings, but a reality that we all have to face at some point. Before we get into today's show, make sure you're checking out our other DFS shows. Every Monday, Matt and I do a cash game review at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time here on YouTube. Every Saturday, the Yahoo DFS Value Show with Matt Harmon drops on the DFS MVP podcast feed, as well as the Yahoo Fantasy podcast feed. And every Sunday morning, the GPP Last Look Show with Jordan Vanek. That is 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, in our subscriber-only Discord. Make sure you get signed up for that in the description below. If you haven't got signed up for it and you're still thinking about dabbling in DFS, our rest of season prices dropped to $24 for the rest of the year, and we go through Super Bowl, so still plenty of time to get value out of that subscription. You can use the promo code DFS MVP for an additional 10% off when you sign up. And today's podcast is brought to you by WynnBet. WynnBet is bringing you the excitement of Wynn Las Vegas to online sports betting. Get in on all of your favorite teams, players, and sports. From boosted parlays to live in-game odds on every major sport, we have what you need to win. Sign up today to receive a special offer, a risk-free $1,000 sports bet. Download the WynnBet app and use promo code 4for4 to claim your risk-free bet today. Matt, welcome to Week 14, sir.
Happy to be here.
Yeah.
I just want to say, that this is it. This is my least favorite week of DFS so far, just because the puzzle is one that I just didn't like figuring out.
Yep.
The timing of the news was all sorts of wrong. And the value plays, we'll talk about it a little bit, but they didn't really start to present themselves, really, a couple exceptions here, but they didn't really start to present themselves really today. So I'm not happy about this slate, but I am happy to be here, excited to dig in.
Yeah, it's a weird slate. The three big teams, Kansas City is projected for a lot of points, but they've been struggling. And then everybody is going to want to play the Bills and the Bucks, but they're super expensive. But we do have some values like always. So let's jump right into it, talking about your favorite quarterback for Week 14.
Yeah, so we got to dig into these value plays because really until today, we didn't have any clarity about any sort of low salary options on either site at the skill position. So getting to premium salary quarterbacks seemed like a luxury we really weren't going to be able to afford in most builds this week. So I started looking at those lower salary quarterbacks, and there's going to be an obvious one you mentioned, but I think I'm going to go back to Cam Newton. I know it was really ugly, really ugly last week, but really this is all about rushing upside and a high quality matchup. That's it. No more, no less. Yes, I understand that a 23% completion percentage and 92 passing yards before being benched does not make a fantasy football starting quarterback. I understand that, but we only have a one-game sample size of Cam Newton against a poor quality defense, the Washington football team, and he had a fine game, 77.8% completion percentage, 7 yards per attempt, 46 rush yards, and 26.2 fantasy points. That's a top 3 fantasy quarterback. So I don't really want to overthink this one. There are some more obvious spots that I feel like are going to be more popular, but because it's a little bit less salary than your player here, I do think that this is a week where you're going to need every couple of $100 that you can scrounge up. So I do think Cam Newton is someone I'm willing to bet on, and you're going to hear me talking about this team a little bit more later as well.
Yeah, we want to be attacking the Falcons with just offenses in general, and I don't think anybody expects or expected Cam to come in and be a great passer. He's never been a great passer. That's not how he plays, but he has been a good quarterback, a good real life and fantasy quarterback, and a lot of that is because of his rushing. The reason that Cam, or one of the reasons Cam was really stymied against Miami, the same thing that they did against Lamar a couple weeks before that, is Miami just blitzes like crazy, and like they'll run all out blitzes nonstop against players like Cam and Lamar. I don't think we have to worry about that with the Falcons. The Falcons rush 5 or more pass rushers at the 10th lowest rate in the league. So it's just usually their front forward or front three, depending on what defense they're playing, without much more help. And also, even though, I mean, they've struggled against quarterbacks in pretty much every respect, but they've allowed the second highest QBR in passes under 15 air yards, and that is where we want Cam to succeed as a passer. He's not going to, rip it deep, and when he does, he's usually not very accurate. He actually was last year, which was weird, but over the course of his career, he hasn't typically been too accurate on those passes, so I think Cam Newton is a fine play.
Yeah, we really have no idea what he's actually capable of. The volatility is apparent, though. We could say that the highs are high and the lows are going to be very low.
Yeah, definitely. A quarterback who isn't going to have low lows is Taysom Hill at 7,700 on FanDuel, 5,600 on DraftKings, playing at the Jets. The Saints are favored by 5.5 with a respectable implied point total above 24 points. And the reason we say Taysom Hill is never going to have a low floor is because he rushes so much. He's the closest quarterback to Lamar in terms of rushing upside. I mean, you could even argue more right now just because Lamar hasn't been putting up a lot of points in any respect. But we saw Taysom Hill get the 100-yard bonus last week on the ground, still scored over 27 DraftKings points, even with 4 interceptions over his 5 career starts as a quarterback, 62 rushing yards per game. And we have him projected on DraftKings at least as the QB7, but priced as the QB13, and it's similar on FanDuel. So that big gap tells us that he is a fantastic value. And everybody talks about Taysom Hill as a runner, and that's where his value comes from. He's been a decent passer when he's been given a full complement of snaps. Now, he is dealing with the injured finger this week, but in 3 of his 5 starts as a quarterback, at least 230 passing yards and 2+ touchdowns. The Jets allow the 3rd most schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. So as long as Taysom can throw through that finger injury, which is a big if, I think he does have some ceiling, but he's definitely a safe cash game play this week.
Oh, he's definitely a good cash game play. And I know this is not a betting show, but his passing yards prop is like 180. It's just completely wrong. You could smash the over on that.
Yeah.
And that's not even just talking about his rushing floor and ceiling that he gives you every single week. I mean, he had a truly terrible quarterback, a real life quarterback game against the Dallas Cowboys and still got there easily for fantasy football. He has such a high floor, and it's a much better matchup this week.
Yeah, and a lot of people have talked about the how much him and Alvin Kamara do or don't complement each other. I think with their really weak pass-catching core this year, I actually like him with Kamara because he has his best pass-catching option. Moving on to running back, speaking of Alvin Kamara, before we get into our favorite plays of the week, a little news before we started the podcast today. Elijah Mitchell and Jamal Williams both out. Jeff Wilson at 4,900 on FanDuel, 4,400 on DraftKings will be the value play of the week. He should be in 100% of cash game lineups. And then on the Detroit side, with Jamal out, he was already a thin play as big underdogs against the Broncos. Jamar Jefferson and Godwin Igwebuike probably going to be in timeshare, so I don't think that has much impact on what we're doing. I mean, I guess, maybe it looks like Agwabuke is their pass catcher. He has a few more targets than Jamar Jefferson, but I don't think I'm too concerned about that spot anyway. But let's get on to our favorite plays. We mentioned that we have Jeff Wilson as basically the free square that we didn't think we were going to have this week. It lets us pay up for a couple spots at quarterback at running back if we want to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm going to do that in my builds this week. And while this is certainly not going completely off the board, obviously, I am going a little bit rogue. There are more quote unquote correct answers if you're looking at the 4for4 value metric for both DraftKings and FanDuel. But I am going to take a stand on Alvin Kamara this week. I know we just talked about Taysom Hill's viability in cash games and tournaments a moment ago, but I think Alvin Kamara has legitimately the highest floor and highest ceiling projection of any player in this slate because of the matchup, which is premier. The Jets are approaching 3 times as bad as the second worst defense in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses. And with Ingram out and Ty Montgomery out, there is so much volume to be consumed in this Saints offense. Not to mention Deontay Harris is suspended as well. So I think he's basically the wide receiver one, the running back one, and the only hope of this team being able to move the ball outside of Taysom Hill. So the Jets are technically a run funnel defense. If you look at schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, it doesn't really matter because they're absolutely terrible against every position. But for a value play, I'm often concerned with floor and median projection. Kamara looks okay, and that's probably why his value ranking is in the teens among all skill position players. But that ceiling, truly, I think he has 40-point upside in this spot here against the Jets. It's the best matchup of the year for him, and there's really no one other than Tony Jones.
Yeah, I mean, now that you say that, the 40-point upside thing, and just thinking about how that game likely plays out and how bad like the Jets have been. I actually just tweeted about it before we got on, how the Jets have been so bad against quarterbacks, but they no quarterback has gone nuclear against them. Only one quarterback has gone over 25 DraftKings points, and like the garbage time narrative of like not playing a quarterback because he won't throw late in the game is usually not a good narrative, because if they are up by that much, then they are probably already got there. But teams have just been like had huge leads on the Jets all year, and that has actually kind of been the case. So if early touchdown variance goes Kamara's way, he could really go bonkers. And I do think he is a fine play in any format, but he will be a pivot and probably far less popular than my favorite running back, Austin Eckler, who's priced very similarly at 9,200 on FanDuel, 8,300 on DraftKings as 10-point favorites against the Giants. I mean, the big deal here with the Chargers is Keenan Allen's already out. Mike Williams, we're still waiting to hear. He's been testing negative, but we're not sure how that's going to play out. The point for Austin Eckler is already one of the most heavily targeted running backs in the league. Without their primary guy in Keenan, Austin Eckler's upside for the past game work only goes up. He's the only player on either side on FanDuel or DraftKings that has a double-digit value score on 4 for 4, and those value scores, if you've mentioned here a lot, have really been our guiding light in how we project where we want to spend our salary, what players we're prioritizing. So if we are spinning up a play on a single player this week, he's the player that I am definitely trying to prioritize. And outside of Kamara, I mean, we have like the high salary players on the slate are either not even on the slate, like our normal guys like Kupp and Devontae, and some of the other running backs like JT aren't even on the slate, or the other options are Tyreek or Kelsey, who they cannibalize each other a little bit. There just isn't a lot of spots to spend all the way up. So Eckler actually makes sense as that player for me this week against the Giants, who are 24th in schedule adjusted points allowed to running backs.
Yeah, matchup's great. You got to think that in the second half of the most likely outcome of this game that they are using Eckler plenty. And obviously, if the game does go awry for some reason, he's going to be heavily utilized through the air. I just was looking up this season, Eckler, Keenan Allen, and Mike Williams have combined for a 56% target share. Yeah. I don't think that 56% number really changes if Williams and Eckler are in. If they're splitting something around like 22 to 27% of the target share each, it's just a go no matter what.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of Eckler and the Chargers moving on to wide receivers, I mentioned that Keenan Allen is officially out. We're still waiting on Mike Williams. So there are some really big value implications with that. If Mike Williams is out, Josh Palmer and Jalen Guyton are probably both usable. Also Jared Cook as well. If it's only Keenan Allen out, it's probably only Jalen Guyton that's still usable if Mike Williams plays, because he'll probably line up on the other side. The interesting thing about the Chargers is that Jared Cook's actually run the second most routes from the slot. So if only Keenan Allen is out, I think Cook might actually be the biggest beneficiary. Like Eckler's still going to be a great play, Guyton's still going to be usable, but Jared Cook, if he does get a lot of those slot snaps, he can see the biggest uptick in production. So just make sure you're checking on the site leading up to kickoff tomorrow so we get full clarity on exactly what we're projecting from that game. But let's go back to the game you talked about with your quarterback, and his primary wide receiver is your top wide receiver in DFS.
Wait, you're saying Donald Parham in a GPP though, right?
You know what? I actually put 3 different scenarios on Twitter yesterday of if only Keenan is out, if only Mike Williams is out, or if both are out, and who your favorite play is. And all 3 polls returned Jalen Guyton as the best play in all 3 scenarios, and I think that's absolutely wrong. I think all 3 should be different answers, but I'll give that to. I'll save that one for the Discord if you want my answer. But there's no way that's the right answer. That Jalen Guyton's the answer in all 3 scenarios.
Yeah, gotcha. All right, back to my top value here. And yes, this is still in flux as a Friday evening when we're recording, but I really like the idea of skinny stacking my quarterback pick, Cam Newton, with DJ Moore, who has really had no problem succeeding within putrid offenses before Cam Newton started showing up and being hot and cold week after week. 10 targets and 103 receiving yards is pretty impressive when you consider the starting quarterback only had 92 passing yards himself. Now, I know some of those were from PJ Walker, but the target floor is fantastic for DJ Moore. 7+ looks in every single game he's played this season. He's had 10+ looks in 50% of his games. That's just something you can't really say that about many players in the league, let alone players who are sitting at 6,800 on FanDuel, 6,200 on DraftKings. Not a top tier salary by any means. And Atlanta, as we mentioned before, they're the second worst defense in the NFL in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses. So when you're talking about Moore, who's the wide receiver 4 in air yard share and wide receiver 5 in target share, I think you're looking at kind of a smash spot. He's 20th in our expected fantasy points metric, which, considering the offense he plays in, that's 20th among all players, all receivers. Considering the offense he plays in, I think that's actually pretty impressive, and he's performing right in line with expectation. So, 12th in receptions, 13th in receiving yards. I consider this a breakout year for DJ Moore, if you didn't already, especially considering the context of his offense.
Yeah, I mean, DJ Moore is a weird one because I think people just have a really bad taste in their mouth about this Carolina team in general this year, with the flux of the quarterback situation with CMC being on and off the field. DJ Moore started the season so strong and then had that stretch from week 5 to week 10 where he only had one game with double-digit half PPR points. Now in his last 2 games, at least 12 half PPR points with Cam. I don't think it's a coincidence that he bounced back with Cam. And speaking of, you mentioned you like a skinny stack here, and I know this is a value show. I think it makes a lot of sense to, like, I know Cam Newton is a quarterback that might profile as someone that you would run out as naked in GPPs. I think that makes sense when you have a Cam or a Lamar in an offense where you don't know where the ball is going to go. In this offense, all of the passes are going to DJ Moore, especially with CMC out. So it really makes sense. Even though Cam is going to run and could steal a couple of touchdowns with his legs, in GPPs it makes sense to stack them together.
Yeah, totally agree. Just when we have more clarity about the concentration of an offense, then we just lean on those top options even more.
Yeah, for sure. My favorite high salary guy this week is Mike Evans at 7,200 on FanDuel, 6,600 on DraftKings. We briefly mentioned this Tampa Bay versus Buffalo game. Tampa Bay favored by 3.5 in a game with an over-under hovering between 53 and 54, depending on what sportsbook that you're looking at. Evans really stands out to me this week because, the thing with the Buccaneers and specifically their wide receivers is Evans and Godwin have always kind of hover around the same exact salary. And a lot of times we've actually seen Evans be more expensive even after Godwin has had some of his huge target games. This week, Evans is $500 cheaper on both sides, so the value is clearly there. Even though the Bills have been very good against wide receivers this year, they still haven't been tested without Tre'Davious White, who is out for the season. Obviously, that game last week against New England, New England throws 3 times in the ugly weather game. So I actually think Mike Evans can really exploit that weakness in the Bills secondary without Tre'Davious this week. The target shares have been very balanced since Gronk returned from injury 3 weeks ago. Gronk, Mike Evans, and Godwin all averaging over 8.5 targets per game in the last 3 weeks. In that span, Evans still leads the team in air yards, still leads the team in expected touchdowns per our air yards model, and he's actually 5th in expected fantasy points over the last 3 weeks among wide receivers that are playing on this main slate. And he is like a marginal regression candidate. He's playing slightly below expectations, still really close, so it's not like he's not popping in our model or anything, but his overall usage is near the top of wide receivers on this slate.
And this is a great reminder to not double count things. Every projection system knows that Mike Evans is playing the Bills and they are number one in most defensive pass metrics. We know in our projection system that Buffalo is number one in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. The value metric still says it's a strong play. You can move ahead after that point. You don't have to think about the matchup again. And we know that Tampa Bay in game script adjusted pass rate basically passes at the highest rate in the league. They're a top 5 team in pace. And so they create shootouts. Go back to our DFS MVP show from last week to hear more on that topic. But I think this game, obviously highest total of the week, and Evans is the value option, especially with so much ownership going to Fournette or projected to go there. I mean, this passing attack in general.
Yeah, definitely. I like that a lot. I actually like your next guy because I think it is a spot where I think people might be a little gun shy about this offense right now just because they have so many weapons. But I like that you're taking a stand on one of their guys.
Yeah, and this is actually where I've sort of settled in this show recently with specifically my second wide receiver pick is a player on an offense where people aren't really trusting the overall efficiency, but the volume and the necessity of that team to get the ball into their playmakers' top playmakers' hands outweighs any concerns about the overall efficiency here. And I'm talking about CeeDee Lamb and the Dallas Cowboys, and specifically this Tony Pollard injury is a bigger deal for the overall offense than I think people are realizing, because it means that both Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard, who would be in the running if healthy for the most productive or most effective player with the ball in their hands, they're hurt. They're really far from 100% healthy. A torn plantar fascia, that's just going to slow down any player, period. I don't care if he's able to play through it. And maybe this salary tier, 7,800 on FanDuel, 7,200 on DraftKings, is going to become slightly less necessary if the Los Angeles Chargers get more value to open up. But I really think we can get CeeDee Lamb having 10 plus targets become a consistent thing in this offense. He was back to returning punts when Cedric Wilson wasn't available last week, to talk about getting it into their playmakers' hands. And he's the wide receiver 14 in value on DraftKings. So he's not someone that we're saying you absolutely have to. But on FanDuel, at least at the time of this recording, he's wide receiver 6. And I think he can be a viable wide receiver 1 on your roster overall. I'm actually surprised to say that he had 13 targets in week 13 and now 7+ looks in 5 of his last 6. This is really a good volume, good matchup, good salary. That equals value to me.
Yeah, the him returning punts is actually a kind of a sneaky point there. I mean, I think the double dip that's been proven not to be very valuable because it's usually double dipping with a crappy player that's returning kicks. But a CeeDee Lamb Dallas defense could be an interesting double dip if he can take a punt to the house. That would be beneficial. And I agree that the Pollard thing is everyone's obviously going to say, oh well, now Zeke can't get all the work, and I guess maybe in theory that's true. The problem is like the Cowboys, if Pollard is out, Zeke is at a point right now. I don't even know if he has an injury designation right now, but there's obviously something not right with him. And I think he needs to be spelled at some point throughout the game. And I'm wondering if maybe the way that they spell him or give him a little bit of a rest is by just running maybe some more empty sets than they have, or than they have all season. Because they've said Amari Cooper isn't going to be limited at all. Obviously, they have Gallup back, and Schultz is a very good pass catching tight end. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them run some empty with if Pollard is out.
And some more snaps, I guess, for Noah Brown if you're playing GPP, something like that.
Yeah, maybe. Moving on to my guy who is also questionable, like Pollard, is Elijah Moore versus New Orleans, but he's so affordable at a position where we don't have very obvious paydown options. I still wanted to mention him, even though we are going to be waiting to get clarity on that probably until Sunday morning. But his opportunity is huge. Already near the top of the league in targets over the last month. Their number 2 wide receiver in targets in the span, Corey Davis, is out. Elijah Moore, 9.3 targets per game in that span. 4th in market share of air yards in that span. The Jets are 27th in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. And I'm sorry, the Saints are. And the Jets have actually been above average in neutral passing rate over the last 6 weeks, just slightly above average, but teams have been throwing against the Saints at the 10th highest rate in neutral game script in that same span. So the way to attack that New Orleans team is through the air. And we actually seen this offense get a little bit of a spark with Zach Wilson last week. So maybe they finally let him play like he's Mike White.
Yeah, that's all we can hope. And you know what's really interesting? Most defensive narratives change, and often change drastically year to year. Just think about last year where we were talking about Pittsburgh and LA, the Rams as some of the best defenses we've ever seen. They've certainly fallen off. One of the narratives that has held for several years now is that you can't run on New Orleans. And we see it once again this season. Number 1 by a pretty good measure in yards per carry allowed all season long. They are a clear pass funnel defense. The Jets are gonna need to get over the top in order to keep this game close.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, that's a game that has some stacking opportunities in it. Some sneaky stacking opportunities. Let's move on to tight end. This is one of my favorite plays of the week because it's usually hard to pay up at the position. But if we get with the Jeff Wilson and with the possible having Guyton or Josh Palmer, I actually think it's a nice week to pay up at tight end in cash games.
Yeah, and the value metric is actually kind of guiding us there naturally, especially on FanDuel. It's not point chasing to go right back to the well with George Kittle. He's got a great matchup. This is the second tier level of Vegas total games that we always talk about targeting, and it's the closest in terms of spread here of those high total games. So that's always a game we're going to want to target the top skill position players. He's the top value tight end on both sites, and on FanDuel, it is 33% higher than the next closest tight end. It's in that 7.5 range, whereas most of the wide receiver ones are sitting at that like 5.5, 6.0 range, essentially saying Kittle is at or above the value of many of the lower level wide receiver ones, at least on FanDuel this week. His 5.2 yards after catch per target leads all tight ends, and anyone who watched him last week, that stat should not surprise you at all. And just the fact that if you look at his totals this year, just among all tight ends, he's top 10 in receptions, receiving yards, and total touchdowns. The man was on IR. He missed I believe he missed 4 weeks already this season, and he's still top tier in totals. 7+ looks in 5 of his last 7 games, including 12 last week. And the offense is going to concentrate, especially in the passing game, against with Ayuk and Kittle. So if Debo is in, obviously that puts a little bit of a damper on Kittle's projection, but I still think I'll go there because Cincinnati is quietly 5th worst in the NFL in schedule adjusted fantasy points to opposing offenses. as we said, close, high total games and we just want those playmakers. Kittle is certainly one.
Yeah, I like that we're finally getting Kittle going nuclear earlier in the season. When we had been talking about him, we've mentioned how little he has scored throughout his career, and he's finally getting all of that back at once. Yeah, I think if Debo plays, I think I mean obviously it'll move Kittle's projection. I think he's probably still my favorite tight end play of the week. I mean, we'll have to see how JP moves projections, but I lean that Kittle's. I mean, he's just playing so well right now, and they're using him so much. I don't know if Debo necessarily hurts him. I briefly mentioned Jared Cook when we were talking about all of the Chargers news, so he's probably the best value, but again, we still don't have complete clarity on that. But another very good value this week is Austin Hooper at $5,000 on FanDuel, $3,400 on DraftKings against the Ravens. Cleveland favored in that game, and David Njoku is out with COVID. Cleveland is 7th in total team targets to the tight end position, and we saw Austin Hooper play a season high 90% of snaps last week. So I mean, and besides Jarvis, I mean they don't really have anybody to throw to. I mean they'll chuck a couple to Peoples-Jones, but he's not going to take on too many targets. So Austin Hooper is a really good pay down option this week, and you like their defense.
Yeah, we can correlate it. Also, Harrison Bryant, they were using an irrational amount of 3 tight end sets. Harrison Bryant looks like he's trending towards out as well, giving even more clarity to this Austin Hooper pick. I like it a lot. And we've talked about this as not quite as strong of a positive correlation as the running back defense combo, but absolutely you can stack a tight end and their defense. And the Browns defense is one of the best value plays, especially on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I wrote this in my cash game article. It's probably best not to overthink this, especially in cash games. Just play the Chargers, especially against Mike Glennon with possibility of multiple receiving options being out in New York. But the only problem I have with the Cleveland defense is I'm always a little nervous starting a defense against a rushing quarterback, particularly one as good as Lamar Jackson. We have seen defenses, especially those that blitz well, able to bottle up Lamar in a way that we haven't seen before. And I also don't want to lean too heavily on the fact that in week 12, Cleveland really frustrated Jackson. That's obviously exciting and why I'm picking them. But 4 turnovers and just 16 points of total offense for Baltimore is something we don't see most defenses able to do against Baltimore this year. So just noting that Cleveland is top 10, that's tougher for opposing offenses in yards per carry allowed and in yards per pass attempt allowed, and their own rush first offensive attack reduces the play volume of opposing offenses. That's something we talked about. That negative correlation is something we talked about in the DFS MVP last week. So if they play the way they want, that reduces the amount of damage that Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore offense can do. So again, it's probably not necessary on FanDuel, but on DraftKings, they are the lowest salary positive value defense, and that's always worth noting.
Yeah, I mean they're a home favorite, which is fine. And usually when I could just find the cheapest favorite, let alone a home favorite, I think it's going to be a very good value. I mean the Ravens obviously have been struggling on offense. I'm not convinced that Lamar's just like broken all of a sudden. But I mean the way things have been going, I don't think you are like the value is still fantastic. Playing a Browns team in this spot. Another team that is a really good value, at least a very big favorite, are the Seahawks, 4,500 on FanDuel, and then all the way down to 3,100 on DraftKings as 8.5 points against Houston. Again, looking at all of the big favorites, the Seahawks teams favored by 7 or more. Seahawks are by far the cheapest one on DraftKings. They're relatively affordable on FanDuel. Like 4,500 is expensive, but you should be able to get up to them in most spots. The Texans are bottom 3 in adjusted sack rate allowed, and they've allowed the most schedule adjusted points to opposing defenses. Davis Mills getting the start now, and apparently for the rest of the season. He has the fourth highest sack rate this year and the sixth highest interception rate. So Seahawks are probably going to get things going too late in the season to make any noise for what their concerns are. But for fantasy purposes, I think Seahawks, they should roll in this one pretty comfortably.
Yeah, they've been better defensively. Some of their per play efficiency metrics are still pretty bad, but
Yep.
against a backup quarterback, I still am going to take that every time.
Yeah, definitely. Before we move on to this week's theory segment, I want to tell you about the easiest and most fun way to spice up your fantasy football season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their brand new pick'em game. Just pick the over or the under on your favorite or your least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you can take home some cold hard cash. Head over to 4for4.com/underdog to claim your free pro subscription and get $10 in bonus cash to play this weekend. Don't bet the under on the Dalvin rushing total like I did last night. Let's move on to the theories segment where we're talking about, if you're going to lose, you might as well just lose in spectacular fashion, right? Let's talk about handling downswings. It's something that is a reality in DFS, something that if you're playing this game consistently, it's a really hard game, and even the best players in the world are going to have losing streaks, especially in NFL where if you're only playing the main slate on Sundays, you only have 18 trials to play, and that is not a lot of reps. And I've talked about this exact quote from a Jonathan Bales book probably every season in every bankroll article that I talk about this exact thing. If you have a normal distribution of tournament finishes and a 20% long-term ROI, you still have about a 16% chance of being down after a sample of 1,000 GPPs. If you're a long-term winner that only plays one tournament lineup per week, you have somewhere in a 1 in 6 chance of still being down after 62 seasons of NFL action. Obviously, that is a huge outlier. That's only playing one lineup per week, but like that quote just really exemplifies like how much variance can really come into play in this game. That is just a very difficult to play to begin with. But let's just talk about the point today is to like when we do find ourselves in the midst of like a 3 or 4 week streak where we've returned nothing. What we can do to battle it psychologically and just to make sure our process is staying sound in those trying times.
Well, I think the first thing, and maybe the most important thing to remember, is that every single DFS player and really every single game player, anyone who's trying to get great at any skill, deals with these plateaus consistently. Even the best in the world deal with these downswings all the time. And so, yes, when you have a larger or the largest bankroll, as some of the top professionals do, you can handle those downswings differently, but you can absolutely handle those downswings better. So I do want to talk about some of the things that I find really important. And I don't think of it as more of these tips as like a numbered list as 1, 2, 3, 4, but more of like a wheel and things that I want to check in on congruently together, because none is more important than the other. But you already mentioned it. Variance plays such a large part in the scoring for fantasy football, and that trickles down to our bankrolls, to our cash outs. And so it might feel better to win or lose, but ultimately it was variance, dare I say luck, that made the difference there. So the first thing you want to do when you feel like your process is ready for real time and you're putting real money on the line and you have downswings is just to simply increase your reps so that you know that you can know that it's then time, if things still aren't working, that it's time to move on to the next phase. But increasing your reps, especially in NFL, is harder than you think. You got to be conscientious about it, but it's not impossible. And when you do increase your reps with solid process, you absolutely increase your expected value over time.
Yeah, increasing reps is, I mean, playing more slates is really the only way to do it. Playing as many games as possible. Obviously, the reps are going to be a little bit different because the skill set of playing, a 4 game slate versus a full slate is slightly different. Playing a showdown slate isn't necessarily increasing reps on your main slate. But I do think it is important that you are playing, as many as possible. If you're playing even just the early only slate versus the full slate, like that's big enough where it plays like a full slate, the early only slate. And if you are playing cash games to, it gives you a naturally different lineup, especially if you're somebody that only plays one cash lineup. Nobody like the multi-day slates have completely fallen out of favor. But especially if you are learning and you're trying to get more reps, like there's no rule that says you can't play the multi-day slate. They still have those available, so that you can still or play the full Sunday slate that includes a Sunday night game. Like that's the easy way to get more reps. And the thing about NFL is that the pricing algorithms have changed so much from year to year. Even within the season they'll change, and the season is so short that even the most experienced, highest win rate, profitable NFL player or players in the world, like mathematically, none of us probably have a sample size to say that we are definitive long-term winners in NFL DFS. Now, most likely the players that are winning most consistently, are the best players, and the trends are most likely true. But from just a mathematical like variance perspective, I don't think there's anybody in the world that could definitively say how good or how precisely good they are at DFS or at NFL DFS specifically. Like there isn't enough time. But we still want to maximize the edge that we think we have as much as possible. So if you are somebody that isn't, especially if you aren't sure, if you're early in the process, play the full slate, play the full Sunday slate, play the early only slate, play the Sunday to Monday slate. I don't even know if a Thursday to Monday slate's still available, but play it. You can get 5 full slates in a week. Even though you're gonna have a ton of overlap, it is still a little bit different, and you are just giving yourself more options. But after we've got there, let's just talk about, and a lot of this theory segment is kind of just going to be a review of things that we've talked about in the past, like going back and checking on those things. But I mean, these are the things we need to make sure we're doing, because once we get 12, 13, 14 weeks into the season, we haven't maybe a lot of players haven't even thought about these things in 12 weeks. Like we might have a really good review process before the season starts, and once week 1 hits, we're just building lineups and not doing anything else. So dealing with downswings, I think, is a really good time to be evaluating those things. So talk about some of those things in evaluating your process, what we mean by that.
Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll say as we put a bow on that part of the topic here is that when you play different size slates, something like the Sunday night, Monday night, you actually start to get used to the game theory aspects, the decision making process that you can then recognize when you get to a main slate. When you've played a bunch of 2 games or 4 game slates over the course of the year, and then you get to the Thanksgiving slate and everyone in the rest of the NFL is kind of adjusting to it, you're used to these kinds of things. So I really think that is not just an advantage in getting reps and just letting variance play itself out, but also in your ability to just make sound decisions over and over again. Now, that comes from evaluating your process so that you can improve your process. And this comes down to player selection, game selection, and contest selection. And if you're not tracking all 3 of those levels, you're probably not adequately tracking yourself enough to know the sore spots that you have that you need to improve. And I think one area that people forget in order to find, well, what would improve me, is they forget to just go look at people's lineups who won, especially the pros who consistently are winning. That is absolutely one of the most important parts of evaluating your own process. Look at the way that they built their lineup. You're probably going to see correlations well. You're probably going to see game stacks that you thought about. Think about what they thought about to get to that lineup and ask yourself legitimately, are you building lineups that are actually built to win tournaments, to win first place or are you building lineups with not losing in mind? Because I can guarantee you the latter will force you to lose more often than not.
Yeah, I mean the information advantage that we have in DFS, the minute lineups lock, obviously, we have games that we're waiting to start, but the minute lineups lock, we get to see everybody's hand, right? We get to see exactly what everybody has done. There's no, like, you've already called. You already get to see the winning hands, and the best players in the world. Their lineups are available to you every single week. So the things that you should be looking for, I mean, obviously, if you're losing, you're not having the same exact lineup as the winning lineups because they're winning. But the things you should be looking for is, are you targeting or have you even thought about, like in GPPs, similar games as they have? Sometimes we'll see. I mean, we saw Mike Leone a couple weeks ago took down Thunderdome with a super contrarian Pittsburgh stack. If that's never even in your mind, then maybe you need to think about your process and why you're not thinking about those types of things. And then outside of that, just look at how, again, we might not have the same exact players, but things to look at is how are players allocating salary, especially like in cash games. Were you spinning up at running back and spinning down at wide receiver? Were you flexing a running back versus a wide receiver? Did you pay an expensive running back when everybody else was playing a cheap quarterback? All of the way you can allocate salary, that is a very important process. If your builds are completely different than the winning lineups consistently, then you probably have a fundamental flaw in your game. And another thing for both cash games, but more for GPPs, how are you allocating? I don't know if allocating is the right word, but how is ownership spread throughout your lineup? Like in cash games, if you have a bunch of players that are not popular, you're probably doing something wrong. Like obviously a ton of overlap isn't going to be great, but the best cash game plays usually show up with very high ownership percentages. And then in GPPs, are you being like properly contrarian? So many people say they're being contrarian, send me their lineups, and then they don't have a single player that's in less than 10% of lineups. They might be playing something like the Millionaire, the Yahoo Baller or something. And they're like, I mean, this lineup's doing so well, but this is dumb. I'm never going to, how do I not play this guy? It's such a good play. It's like, well, yeah, that's why they're popular. And a lot of people really are just very bad at being contrarian, especially if you're new to DFS, because you're playing crappy players. You're playing players in bad spots. That's why they're not popular. So it's something that I think is really important, and people, you really should be looking at some other lineups. I know you want to talk about. I actually kind of you mentioned reviewing game selection. I talked about that. I kind of want to talk about that separately. Is there anything else, just like on general process, that you want to touch on before we talk about reviewing your game selection?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered it. I actually set a specific tangible goal for myself that I don't want to be surprised by a single player going off. Someone who hits their ceiling, I want to have at least thought about it. And if I don't, then I'm going to go back and try to track what I missed from a data perspective.
Yeah.
But, obviously I'm not going to have the winning lineup every time, but I do think that, to your point of, if your builds are just structurally and fundamentally different, then that's when you got to take another step back.
Yeah, definitely. And then just like some general things that I think you should be thinking about. Again, I think the game selection process review is probably a huge leak in most people's games. But I mean, just general process notes, like how much or how little info you're taking in. Like you can definitely have information overload, or you can be on the opposite of it, especially if you are like a content creator or something like that, where you don't have time to take in other points of view. We'll talk about reviewing the best game sites and slates, but just having a process to track that information. And then one thing, just from a lineup building perspective, is, are you consistently late swapping? Like nobody late swaps ever. I mean, and they admit it. Like I put out polls every year on Twitter, and it's always like I think like usually it's like less than 20% of people say that they use late swap kind of consistently, but the entire DFS ecosystem, it's probably less than 5%, if not even way lower. And a lot of times when we're late swapping, and we talk about this a lot on the cash game review, all you're really end up doing is like losing less money, not losing as much. A lot of times that's what the late swap ends up doing, and you still have a losing week. So it can be really hard to grasp that, because it doesn't feel like you won, but money not lost is still money in your bankroll, right? So if you could turn your week from if you're a negative 40% week to only a negative 20% week, that's still money that you're saving. So it's really important. So just thinking about those things. Do you want to talk about how we can review our game selection process? Do you want to talk about like the tracking that I mentioned?
Yeah, I think I'll talk about sort of how we can track our progress because I
Okay.
do feel like, well, actually, I think the biggest thing is that this is a daunting task, actually, and I'm
Yeah.
still refining my process too. I have in my notes that evaluating your process takes immense work on top of the work you're
Yeah.
already doing to get ready for DFS slates. And I think this is the moment, this is the part of the process that actually takes the most time. Do you have a way of tracking your plays on a player by player basis, on a lineup by lineup basis? Or if you're playing like a small amount of lineups, I know a lot of people listening are playing somewhere between 1 to 20 lineups a week. Are you thinking about things on a player, like a literal decision by decision basis? This 2v2 versus 2v2? Because I'm not saying you should go journal every single week, but you need to have some sort of way to quickly look up your decision making process and then be able to track your results. This isn't always easy with automated software. Obviously, there are things
Yeah.
like Roto Tracker. You can upload your history. Those are really designed for mass multi-entry players,
Yep.
players who are playing a lot of volume, who want to
Yep.
see trends that way. Tracking progress for small entry players, it requires more qualitative research than quantitative sometimes.
Yeah, and Roto Tracker is really good if you are playing relatively high volume because you can get a really quick snapshot of how you're playing in each game on each site, on each slate. So that is really important if you do have high volume to see where you are succeeding and losing the best, and maybe lopping out, just stop not playing some of the games you aren't good at, or can help really quickly. Like my process, I like going old school spreadsheet just because I break things up kind of uniquely compared to RotoTracker. But one thing, especially if you're playing on DraftKings, that I think should be part of your tracking process is not just looking at the lineups and seeing what the best lineups are doing. They let you download CSVs of all the ownership and all of the lineups. So like it just gives you a really quick snapshot of everything that's going on. So however you want to use that, it's up to you what's important to you. But I think it's an insanely valuable tool that probably most people aren't doing. Like luckily for me, it's part of my weekly content, so I'm forced to do it. But it is a really good exercise in downloading, downloading those player CSVs and seeing quickly, oh, like not only was Tom Brady a good play this week, but like he was in I don't know 20% of the top 100 lineups, and I never even thought about him. So going back to that point that we talked about up top is really that is really important. Let's talk about specifically reviewing. We talked about reviewing our process. Let's talk about specifically reviewing our contest selection and what you mean when you are reviewing what games you're playing.
Well, ultimately, I think different lineups are built for different contests.
Yeah.
And, we certainly have strategy shows that are based all around this concept. If you're playing one lineup or three lineups, or if you're playing against 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 people, your strategy about lineup building can start to drastically vary. So ultimately, if you're entering cash game lineups into GPP tournaments, there might be some weeks where the optimal lineup kind of hits the cash line, but you're essentially never gonna win. And
Right.
there are a ton of players who are in large field tournaments who don't really know that they're basically DOA before the
Yeah.
tournament starts.
Yeah.
And that might sound harsh to hear, but ultimately, one thing that I do look at is I strangely want lineups that aren't around the middle, around the 50th
Yeah.
percentiles. Like I'm trying to build lineups that have a legitimate potential at first place. That means they have a level of uniqueness, a level of contrarianism, but they also mix in chalk players correctly for the context of the contest it's in. So I think especially if you're a player who like has access to the 4for4 optimizer, and it really gives you comfort to use the projections, which are really top notch at 4for4, then maybe you want to start focusing more on cash games or small field tournaments where it only takes one deviation or two deviations from those optimal lineups. But maybe there are listeners or watchers here who like to hand build and they want to feel imaginative and then want to mix in the chalk players that they feel are worth it.
Yeah.
It that type of figuring out what type of player you are takes time, and you need to have a tracking process, whether it's notes or a spreadsheet, to learn what type of player you are. And once you do figure out what type of player you are, it's super important to stay consistent and keep playing those tournaments so that you can figure out if you actually are good at it. You can't just keep switching from contest to contest.
Yeah, I think there is, again, this is specific to GPPs, but I do think there is, for a lot of people, like a psychological barrier to seeing their team come in like 9,900th place out of 10,000 people, and not wanting that to happen again. Like they would rather lose and be in the 50th percentile than lose and be in the bottom 5 percentile. Like I do think that is a real thing. And that's probably very bad. Like, teams that are contrarian are, when you're a couple players dead and you have a 1% player that does nothing, you're going to be very close to the bottom. And kind of similar to what you discussed, I think that people need to understand, with just in looking at what they're playing, and if they are in a losing streak, or do you have a cash game heavy approach or GPP heavy approach or a mixed approach? If you have 5 weeks in a row where you haven't come close to cashing a GPP, you might still be okay. Like, you want to be reviewing, but there's a chance you're still okay. If you have four or 5 weeks in a row, like if you're playing 100 head-to-heads every week and you have 5 weeks in a row where you're like only winning like 10 or 15% of your head-to-heads, like you probably have some huge error in a game. It just doesn't, that usually isn't the case in cash games. It's obviously very possible, but just more likely that you are you're in a bad spot. And then same thing, you said a lot of people are just dead on arrival once they enter the contest. This is probably more GPP specific, but if you're playing the same exact lineups in say the millionaire as you are in like a small field high stakes contest, you're probably not playing optimally. You should be building different types of lineups. Now, I'm not saying don't put like I always throw my high stakes single entry lineup in the millionaire, just because if it does go bonkers I would lose my mind. But like, you don't have to do that could get expensive. But you should be building different based on the type of tournament you're playing. I think a couple other things are just like really quick hitting game selection things. Are you actually looking for the best structures? Like there is something to be said for chasing flatter payout structures. Now, you will lose some upside, but I do think it is really important to find good game structures. And on that note, if you're just, one thing that can happen is if you're used to playing one game, whatever site you're on, the games have the names, right? Those, like, if you're playing like the power sweep or whatever on DraftKings, those structures actually can fluctuate quite a bit from week to week. So make sure you're just looking at that in some way. Are you seeking overlay? Are you building upside into your cash lineups? Like, are you throwing those into small tournaments or to multipliers? All those things add up to really getting more money into your account. Like, just because you're a winning player, if you're not doing all of these things, throwing your lineups into other types of contests, seeking the best contest, this all goes to your bottom line.
Yeah, and I'll add one to that, the concept of layering, something that we talked about too, where in contests that are multi-entry, that are like 3x or 5x, we talked a lot about entering your cash game lineups in there, but those multi-entry contests can also accept your single entry lineups, your 3 entry lineups.
Yeah,
And so if one of them goes off and you're getting 5x or 10x, suddenly a day where all of your other lineups drew dead, that one helped your entire week. You want that one win, you want that one lineup to help your entire year, entire decade. If it, that's ultimately why we're talking about the strategy concept. But let's talk about the final step here. And this is probably the toughest step, and it's going to be different for every single person out there. But this is when, okay, so we've talked about these scenarios where, things look bad and you might have a fundamental problem that applies to you. Well, I actually think that getting out of your desk, getting out of your computer is the most important part. Let's take the psychological side of this seriously for a moment. I'm not saying you have to be all therapist on yourself for a moment, but seriously, take your ideas for a walk. If you don't know that phrase, a lot of people have found that when they are moving or even just doing some sort of light exercise, like walking, they're able to take an idea or just pontificate a little bit further, take their ideas a little bit further, which is really all we want. We want to just be slightly different than our competition while analyzing the same information. So on that same note, we want to be eating better than our competition if we can. We want to be sleeping better if we can. We want to be exercising better. I know this sounds silly or just like hogwash, and you can toss it if you want, but all of this leads up to making optimal decisions. When we're in an optimal state, we have a higher probability of making decisions better than our opponents. And remember, this is a game of razor thin margins where we're just making slightly better decisions than our opponents in order to win. So finally, just I know this is different for everyone, but this game also requires a bit of imagination.
Yep.
Projections don't win GPPs. I mean, I'm talking a little bit more about tournaments now, but projections don't win those, especially median projections. It's about making slightly different decisions, and coming to high quality different decisions actually requires you to be in a good state of mind. So if you know a way to flex that imaginative muscle, I encourage you to do that as well.
Yeah, I think, and on the flip side, you mentioned, we've done these reviews and all of a sudden we find these leaks that we need to plug up. I think it could be even more frustrating if you go through all the review processes that we talked about and you still feel like you're doing the right thing and like, okay, now what the hell do I do to deal with this losing streak? I think that could be just as, if not more important. One thing, and I know we only have 18 weeks, I mean, you can take a week off. Like there's nothing even though we said play more slates to get your volume up. Like if you're struggling, like if building a lineup all of a sudden feels like a chore to you, take a week off. Like you might come back hungrier, you might come back more focused, you might come back with less stress, you might come back more excited. But there's nothing wrong with just taking a slate or a week off. I mean, and kind of to a similar note, there's a poker coach named Tommy Angelo, and he focuses kind of on the psychological side of poker, and he has this practice that he has a lot of students do, and it's he has them fold pocket aces before the flop, and it's basically just a practice in separating yourself from the results, and like you're not married to these aces, and obviously it's a negative EV play, right? But it's just something like prove to yourself that you do this thing. I think kind of a similar practice, and I've done this a lot of times to remove yourself from the results. I know we love football, and I know it, like we only get so many weeks to do it. There's times where like I'll just take a Sunday off. I'll set my lineups, but then I'll just go take a Sunday off and do something and not watch the games. And obviously we lose a little bit of information, but nobody knows how to watch film anyway. You guys don't know what you're talking about when you say you do. Like just that kind of separates yourself from the results. And it is kind of liberating to have these set lineups, not be watching the games, come back to the results. You almost are like, you're not tied to these, like all these what if scenarios, watching the games, losing your mind. I think it is a fun little practice. I know it's not for everybody. Watching the games, half the sweat is the fun, but try it 1 week and see how you feel. And you talk about the imagination part of it. Like there is a lot of very complimentary content out there, whether it be reading or videos, it's not DFS related, but it's related to how we think about games, how we think about strategy, how we think about math, variance, life. Jonathan Bales has put out some incredible book lists that I think probably most people haven't even put a dent in, and that's probably been one of the biggest differences in my games, and just like learning how to think differently, learning how to think about games. If you're a football player and you've played fantasy football, but you haven't ever played anything like chess or poker or something like that, or just done anything where you're just thinking about these game theory type scenarios, randomness and stuff like that, I think it really can open up your mind quite a bit. And then one other thing I would say is, like, if you are going, like, I think one thing that if you've reviewed all these processes, it's really easy to get spread thin, right? I think most people are probably playing too much or too many games or sites. Especially for new, like focus on a single game and a single website and get really, really good at that. And even if you have results and you might be a slightly better cash game player than a GPP player, if you like GPPs more, play more of them, practice more of them, because you're gonna have fun researching it and getting it. And if you don't like the variance of GPPs, like, who cares what everybody else says? If you're not, maybe you'll never win $1 million, but if you like grinding cash games, like, get really, really good at that. Become the best cash game player in the world. Like, it is stressful, and we are a lot of times wagering a ton of money, but make it as fun as possible for yourself.
Yeah, it absolutely has to be fun enough so that you can put in all this work, all this peripheral work we're talking about that's outside of just picking your lineup and just trying to play the best players. Yeah, just to close things out, I think we've kind of gone through a broad range of topics here, and I hope we helped you guys out if you're kind of going through a down spell here. Just some final reminders. Evaluating your process takes immense work. I just said it, but just know that work is incredibly valuable in knowing yourself as a decision maker. You can't fully evaluate yourself on a single season of DFS slates, especially just main slates, and you really can't evaluate yourself anything close to even 5 or 10 seasons. There's still a lot of variance in there. That's just the nature of the game. Final thing I'll say is, if you're playing to lose, you probably already did. And please avoid the gambler's fallacy. No one is due in DFS.
Yeah.
We can show you our breakout receiver model. We can try our best to show you, or things like that. But absolutely no one is due in DFS.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this podcast, watching this podcast, or subscribing to 4 for 4, hopefully those losing streaks have been very minimal, if not at all. And hopefully you don't need to use this segment too often. But I think it is super valuable and probably inevitable. If you're watching here on YouTube, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also check out our podcast. If you're listening to the podcast, please rate and review on iTunes, and go check out our YouTube channel. Just a reminder, if you haven't signed up for the 4 for 4 DFS subscription yet, the rest of the season price is down to $24, and make sure you're checking out our other live shows. Cash Game Review on YouTube every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, the Yahoo DFS Value Show with Yahoo's Matt Harmon every Saturday on both the DFS MVP and the Yahoo Podcast feeds, GPP Last Look Show every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time with Jordan Vanek on the subscriber-only Discord. And please follow all of us on Twitter. 4 for 4 is at 4 for 4 Football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Monday.